Welcome to the Haven Collective. I'm J.R. Foresteros, and this is the Beacon Bit. When I was in high school, I rode my bike pretty much everywhere. My dad lived in this part of town where everything was really accessible, and I had a car, but I really just enjoyed riding my bike. And so I'd ride my bike to work. I worked at Quick Trip at the time, shout out to Quick Trip, and I just really enjoyed getting around by bicycle. The problem was, at Quick Trip, they didn't have a place to store the bicycle. It was a really small store, and so I usually just kept it out by the dumpster. And probably doesn't take a rocket science to figure out what happened. Yep, one time I got off work and my bike was stolen. I walked home, and the next day my dad asked me where my bike was, and I said, yeah, it got stolen. Easy come, easy go, I guess. What can you do about it? And my dad got furious with me. He said, are you not going to file a police report? Are you not going to report it stolen? Are you not going to do anything to find it? And I was like, there's really no point, right? Like, they're not going to go chase down a bike, which was technically true. But I think what my dad was most angry about was the sort of apathy that I felt towards the loss of my bicycle. That was something that he had purchased for me. It was a gift that he had given to me. And I think he felt deeply hurt and offended by the fact that I seemed to care so little for the loss of my bicycle. Now, what I can recognize now as a grown adult was I was actually really upset by the loss of my bicycle. I felt irresponsible, I felt stupid, I felt foolish, but I couldn't face those things. And so I was practicing a tried and true defense mechanism called denial and avoidance, one that I have been familiar with for a long time. Today we're going to be talking about defense mechanisms because when we get into deep and authentic relationships, they can sabotage our ability to genuinely see another person. Because when we get into those hard conversations, when we start into some difficult areas of relationships, defense mechanisms emerge. They usually come from when we were kids and we didn't know how to deal with the world. And so we created these ways of helping ourselves cope. And they work really great for little kids. They're not so good for adults. So here are some of the defense mechanisms that we typically encounter in our lives. I've already talked about avoidance or denial, right? That's instead of engaging the difficult emotion, we just avoid it. We do things so that we don't have to think about it, or we just say that it's not real. There's something called displacement, where we focus our negative emotions on a person who is safe to focus on them on. Usually it's someone who is at a distance or someone who doesn't have any power or authority over us. This could be like a partner or a child or a friend. And we sort of lay all of that on them because it's easier to put it there and it's safer to put it there than it is to deal with the actual source of it. There's projection, where again, instead of admitting that we are feeling these things, we attribute them to someone else because it's easier to point out negative emotions in someone else than it is to face them in ourselves. There's overreaction, where again, something relatively minor happens and we blow up at it instead of facing it. And then of course, there's everyone's favorite, passive aggression, where instead of dealing with something directly, we have all kinds of ways of dealing with it in subtle or in sneaky ways, or in ways that again are not directly confronting the issue. Defense mechanisms are so problematic in part because we can't see our own defense mechanisms. It's difficult for us to know, partly because of what we've talked about in last month. It's difficult for us to see our own reality as constructed, right? We can't really do that until we are in relationship with someone else and we realize that not everyone reacts to the world the same way we do. That there actually are all of these other different ways of confronting problems or dealing with painful emotions, and we go, oh, that's interesting. I must not be the norm. I must be a particular manifestation of defense mechanisms. In other words, we need community in order to heal from our defense mechanisms, in order to put them aside and engage in a more healthy and life-giving way. We need, in a word, empathy. Empathy is the ability for us to connect with each other. And I think one of the best verses in Scripture that helps us practice empathy is the one from James that we looked at for the Beacon Bit this week, where he says that we need to be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Now, that doesn't directly point at empathy, but I think when we do that, particularly in relationships, it helps disarm our defense mechanisms. It helps us lower our defensive stance so that we can really receive another person in such a way that our own defenses are illuminated. So, what are some steps that we can take to listen well, to practice empathy? Well, I think there's three things that we can do. The first one is called mirroring. When we mirror, we're simply trying to match the other person's emotion. We practice this at Haven when we call it looping there, right? Okay, what I'm hearing you say is this. Is this accurately describing what you're feeling? Am I perceiving the emotion that you're expressing, right? And sometimes that's not always easy. Sometimes fear can look like anger, or sometimes joy can look like anxiety, right? Sometimes these things can be difficult to discern. So mirroring is the process of learning how to accurately understand someone else's emotions. The second is mentalizing. And this is interesting because it's something that only humans really seem capable of doing. We see mirroring in other animals, especially primates and some other mammals, but really humans are the only ones that are capable of saying, okay, my friend is feeling sad. Why are they feeling sad? What are the causes of this? We begin to think through their emotions. And what we're doing is sort of building a map of their experiences and of their thoughts and of their feelings, and we're trying to understand where they are. Then the last thing is caring. And what I mean by caring in this very particular context is that we recognize that what someone else needs when they're, again, let's say sad, right, may not be what I want when I'm sad. My wife Amanda and I talk about this all the time. When we are feeling sick, we want very different things. One of us really enjoys being nurtured and cared for. The other one wants to just be left alone to wallow in their misery. And it can be difficult to understand that when someone is feeling a way that we are familiar with, joy, anger, frustration, whatever, that they may not want or need the same things that I want or need when I feel the same way. So we mirror, we try to understand if we're understanding the correct emotion, then we mentalize, we try to build a mental map of how they're feeling and why they're feeling that way, and then we try to extend some care. Again, rather than assuming that they react the way we do, we try to understand how they want to be cared for. That's all how we learn to listen well, right? We're being quick to listen, quick to practice those things. We're slow to speak, and then we're even more slow to become angry, to put our defenses up, to engage in those defense mechanisms. Now, there's a really interesting tool called emotion mapping that can be really helpful with being slow to anger. You imagine that there are kind of 4 quadrants of emotions, and they're things from high energy emotions to low energy emotions, and then positive emotions to negative emotions. So high energy positive emotions might be things like joy, whereas a high energy negative emotion could be something like anxiety or fear or anger. Low energy negative emotions would be things like despair or depression, sadness, something like that. A high energy or a low energy positive emotion might be something like contentment or peacefulness. Having this quadrant helps us to label our emotions and kind of put them on a map so that when we feel something, our first thing that we're doing is not reacting. We're not just acting out of extreme joy or extreme anger or out of a malaise or out of a contentment, right? We're trying to understand the emotion, we're trying to map where it is, and then that helps us know how to respond to it. It helps us not just throw our defense mechanisms up so that we can genuinely engage another person. This idea of being quick to listen and slow to speak and slow to become angry is a tool that can help us flex that empathy muscle. It can help us engage people where they are, which is often in the midst of a whole bunch of complicated emotions, right? Particularly if we're engaging someone in the midst of a crisis or in the midst of a tumultuous time in their lives or a tumultuous time in our lives. We rarely only experience one thing at a time. And so because of that, empathy is a useful tool for us to practice being quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry so that we can offer each other genuine and authentic connection. We can build those real relationships that we were created for. This week in our Beacons, we're going to talk a lot about how we practice that empathy, what some of our defense mechanisms are, and what it looks like for us to map our emotions. I look forward to that conversation with you. Until then, grace and peace be with you.